And we talked before, you and I, and we talked about the trilateral alliance is broken at the bottom because Japan and Korea do not really complete the triangle. Hello, everyone. This is Mark Peterson with the Frog Outside the Well Research Center, and I'm back today with a guest, a new friend, who is a research associate at Harvard University. And when we started talking, it was very nostalgic for me to talk about the old days and the different buildings and how things have changed these days at Harvard. Mesrob Vartavarian is a scholar in political science and in Rimland Pacific, the areas around the Pacific Basin. And he's done a lot of work on security issues. And we're interested today in talking about the Korean-American alliance and the Korean-Japanese Triple Alliance, which is one of the areas that Mesrob has worked at. Mesrob was a name that I hadn't run into before. It's Armenian. And as Mesrob, you're actually from the Armenian diaspora that's not unsimilar to the Korean diaspora. Is that right?
Indeed, yes, yes. I have diasporic origin, certainly.
Yeah, and you were raised in Los Angeles.
Indeed. The largest Armenian community in America is in LA today, and one of the largest Korean American communities also on Western. So we were near each other.
Yeah, yeah. And did your PhD at Cambridge, England.
Yes.
And now you're in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So you got the best of both Cambridges.
Coming full circle, yeah, in a way, in a strange way.
Now, I've been dragged into this Dokdo thing, and I've been dragged into several commentaries on Japan. Our colleague at the Harvard Law School, who wrote that awful piece about comfort women are all contract workers, a nonsensical piece. He said they were contract workers and they had not one contract to show to prove it. Anyway, I've been dragged into that discussion because of my Korean studies interest, and I've been asked to do a talk on Dokdo. So I did a little bit of background on it. I gave a talk to students in Idaho on Zoom, and I thought, well, I'll put that on my YouTube channel. And I divided it into 3 parts because YouTube pieces are usually better in the 12 to 15 minute category. And I'm disappointed in the outcome of the YouTube because a lot of people watched the first one. I'm at 80,000 views at the first one, but the story, the punchline is in the third one. And in the third one, I said that the resolution to the Dokdo problem would best be seen if Japan were to step up to the plate and say, in the issue of peace and stability, in the issue of the alliance between Korea, the United States, and Japan, we are going to give up any claim on Dokdo. And I suggested that it's a no-lose proposition for Japan because they would lose nothing in the process. And, you know, there's always a quid pro quo in diplomatic affairs. Maybe Japan could suggest that Korea give up any claim to Tsushima. Any Korean claim to Tsushima is not worth very much. They don't give up much in that regard. But, you know, I'm not a securities guy, a political science guy like you are, Mesrob, and I was a little bit insecure in making such a suggestion. I thought people would say, oh, you know, you don't know what you're talking about or whatnot. But you kind of like that idea.
I do. Indeed, I think the main issue from my perspective is not so much Japan taking the first step, but the obstacles that lie in the way of Japan taking that first step. And here we have to consider the nature of Japanese conservatism historically, certainly, how it reconfigured or re-established itself in the post-war period, and indeed how it's evolved. And I think it's evolved in a direction that makes taking that first step slightly more difficult. So to just kind of give a very brief overview. Initially, the United States, there is this idea in the historical literature of the reverse course. When the United States first occupied Japan, it was very liberal, almost very radical under the military government SCAP of Douglas MacArthur. And it's only in 1948 that conservatism reemerges. However, right from the beginning, MacArthur very deliberately defends the emperor and makes sure that the emperor is not charged for any war crimes and maintains his position as the symbolic head of state. In doing so, he already, right from the beginning, placed limits on how far reform in Japan could go. And the conservative groups, mainly in the bureaucracy, use that to begin to reestablish their power. So they jump from the bureaucracy into politics. And this eventually comes together in the formation of the Liberal Democratic Party in 1955.
Yeah, I just wonder if any changes in Japan would only be possible if a more liberal wing of the LDP or a non-LDP prime minister comes in. Is there any chance of that happening?
Unfortunately, there are very stiff barriers to that as well, in the sense that it's a very complicated issue. So to give you just one component of this, Shimane Prefecture, which claims Takeshima Island as belonging to it as an element of Shimane Prefecture, is one of the largest electoral bases for the LDP. Due to LDP gerrymandering, a lot of representatives come out of Shimane Prefecture, and for them to question the linkage between Takeshima, or to renounce Takeshima and acknowledge it fully as Dokdo, would have some very sharp electoral repercussions for them. There's also a very troubling thing that's happened in the last 10 years or so under the Abe Shinzo government, in that the wing of the LDP that is far more ethno-nationalist and conservative has come in to the equation. I personally thought that Abe was the perfect Nixon to go to China type figure, in the sense that Abe could have gone to Seoul and done something like that. But unfortunately, he chose not to do that. So I do think that as long as the LDP remains in its current configuration, that first step will be a very difficult one for the Japanese to take. Although I think they should be the ones to take it at the end.
But you're interested in this as a aspect of the trilateral alliance, which is the United States and Japan. And I'm going to tease you a little bit. You like to say the Rock.
Yes.
And in my world, the word is Korea. But I know people that talk about the Rock. It's the military people and people that are interested in strategic studies, which is you. So when you said the Rock, I knew what camp you were in, and I welcome that, because we need to look at these things from multiple points of view. You know, I think of the Rock, it's really a limited sort of terminology. I think of the soldier that comes to Korea and he says, this is my first time to the Rock. And the Korean says, oh, this boy's confused. He thinks he's in Iraq. So the Rock sounds more like Iraq than, and Koreans never say the Rock, unless it's a military person. But anyway, that's your perspective, and I welcome that. And you're concerned about this trilateral alliance. And we talked before, you and I, and we talked about the trilateral alliance is broken at the bottom because Japan and Korea do not really complete the triangle.
Indeed. I think that is something that the United States it's been a diplomatic headache for the United States ever since really the 1950s. Whereby you have constant efforts by the US to form a linkage between Japan and the Rock, South Korea, and the United States in order to mobilize economic and military and material resources against mainland rivals, Asian mainland rivals of the United States. At that time, of course, it was the Soviet Union and China. Now, of course, it is China. In 1965, there was success in that after great pressure and great effort. Yeah. But again, we have to look at the political configuration in question. The military government of Park Chung-hee, which had ostensibly civilianized with the election of 1963, but was still a very military government, was composed of figures who were Japanese colonial military officers and had a much easier time reestablishing those linkages. And even then there was tension. At base, what made it viable was the economic exchange that took place between Japan and South Korea, in which the Japanese invest very heavily in South Korea and slough off obsolete industries to South Korea, particularly Gyeongsang province, which is also Park's home province. He wants to build that up.
Yeah.
right, North Gyeongsang, and trigger the miracle on the Han. I think it's no one would dispute that Japan plays a vital role in the economic miracle of South Korea.
Yeah.
And there are further possibilities like that existing today. Admittedly, one could say it would move in the other direction because the South Korean economy is far more dynamic than the Japanese economy at present time.
Yeah.
And I think Tokyo would benefit from that tremendously, full-scale normalization, putting the bottom back in the triangle, so to speak.
So one way to look at this triangle and the breaking of the triangle, or the never resolving the triangle, one issue would be Dokdo. If there could be a peaceful accommodation to Dokdo, it might put the triangle together, which would be very much in the United States' interest to see a stronger trilateral organization.
Indeed, I think so. And I think this is something that has to be publicized by South Koreans to the United States. Of course, the United States views Japan as its most important ally. I think this is going to be, without question, the most important alliance of the early 20th century for the United States, the Japanese alliance.
Yeah.
But if South Koreans make it known to policymakers, figures in Washington, that if you tell or if you bring up the subject with the Japanese of Dokdo and what it could mean to us, it would ultimately strengthen trilateralism and ultimately benefit Japan's security, because we would be more willing to participate in ventures meant to contain Chinese revisionism. Not entirely, certainly, but certainly more willing to participate. So this is something that there has to be a conversation between Seoul and Washington about what Japan's recognition of Dokdo could mean for the trilateral alliance.
I'm not a Pacific Rim specialist, but I'm not so naive as to not know that there are problems. And in my video, I mentioned the fact that Japan has disputes with Russia and China, as well as with Dokdo. And I said, perhaps that's one reason why this Dokdo thing would never be resolved, because if Japan gave up Dokdo, they would also have to give up the Kuril Islands and Senkaku. But you said maybe there's a way out of that. Tell me about that.
Indeed, yes. I think that the Senkaku, Yayu Senkaku dispute and the Kuril Island disputes are fundamentally different historically and indeed strategically at present time, because those disputes are rooted in wars between Japan and other sovereign nation states, territorial disputes that emerged during armed conflicts during the first half of the 20th century. Indeed, there is no question that the Kuril Island dispute emerges from a czarist, not so much communist, not so much ideological, but a kind of expanding czarist empire which bumped up against Japan and triggered this reaction, which results in the loss of the Kurils and then their re-seizure in 1945. The Senkaku dispute is very, very heavily imbricated in the Sino-Japanese War, what that meant for China and how it suffered at the hands of Japan, and why this conservative dominance in Japanese politics did not allow a genuine reconciliation. And we talk about the problems of Japan and South Korea. The problems between Japan and China are magnified many fold, for very similar reasons due to Japanese aggression in the Second World War. However, because the Senkakus hem China in, right, strategically speaking, and because the Kuril Island dispute is something used by the Japanese right to justify rearmament and justify the full-scale remilitarization of Japan, the United States would be very reluctant to question that. And I think that we must also note here that the Senkaku Islands are covered by the US-Japan Security Treaty. Any contingency that the US deems sufficiently threatening to Japanese control of the Senkakus would trigger treaty obligations and intervention. These are very different disputes. And I think this is something that Japanese politicians need to explain to their own populations. The Kurils are different. Senkaku is different. Dokdo is something very, very distinct. And it doesn't have these same strategic effects and problems. Japan cannot justify its remilitarization because of Dokdo Takeshima, nor is Dokdo Takeshima hemming China in strategically, or Russia in, really, for that matter. To be honest, during the Cold War, during the Korean War, it was used by the US Air Force from Kadena as target practice. It's just a place to drop bombs. I mean, it's not, you can find any other number of rocks to do that. It's not that essential. And that's something that I think Tokyo really needs to explain to its own population. If there is a courageous Japanese politician that is willing to take that step.
So bottom line, you see some hope, given some liberalizations and some changes, that Japan might be able to give up Dokdo, and we might have a road to renewed peace between Korea and Japan.
Yes, indeed. If the South Koreans explain the situation very carefully to the United States, and if there is a Japanese, probably conservative politician here, it wasn't Abe Shinzo, it should have been Abe Shinzo, but it's going to have to be somebody else now that can take that step, that can be the Nixon that goes to China, the Japanese LDP man who goes to Seoul. Then it's possible that we might get the ball rolling on this and bring about strategic, economic, societal, psychological benefits of great moment to
So
the trilateral relationship.
We see tremendous positive aspects of this. So it's not just this 17th century historian literature guy who's out of his field. I'm really happy to see you telling me and my audience that there is some rational hope for some kind of resolution of the Dokdo situation. Well, that's really great, Mesrob. I really appreciate talking to you and appreciate your perspectives and background. Hey, enjoy Cambridge while you're there. I hope your renewal comes through and you can stay there a good long time.
Thank you so much.
Great environment.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson. Thank you very much for your time.
And thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time. Bye.